Hi everyone! So Peter Singer recently made a post on Instagram promoting his new book called Why Vegan, and he called himself a flexible vegan. I have very mixed feelings. The caption reads, "I call myself a flexible vegan. I'm predominantly vegan, but I don't treat veganism like a religion. I judge actions by their consequences, and the consequences that matter are the benefit or harm we cause to sentient beings." In isolation, I don't have a problem with this post. However, based on things he's said in the past, I do take issue with his idea of flexibility. For example, he has said, "I'm vegan when it's not too difficult to be vegan, but I'm not rigid about this. There's a little bit of room for indulgence in all of our lives. I know some people who are vegan in their homes, but if they're going out to a fancy restaurant, they allow themselves the luxury of not being vegan that evening. I don't see anything really wrong with that." He's also said, "I don't go to the supermarket and buy non-vegan stuff for myself, but when I'm traveling or going to other people's places, I will be quite happy to eat vegetarian rather than vegan. And I won't eat eggs if they're not free range, but if they're free range, I will." And last but not least, to avoid inflicting suffering on animals, not to mention the environmental costs of intensive animal production, we need to cut down drastically on the animal products we consume. But does that mean a vegan world? That's one solution, but not necessarily the only one. If it is the infliction of suffering that we're concerned about, rather than killing, then I can also imagine a world in which people mostly eat plants, but occasionally treat themselves to the luxury of free-range eggs, or possibly even meat from animals who live good lives under conditions natural for their species, and are then humanely killed on the farm. What? Based on all of this, I would categorize Singer as a flexitarian welfarist rather than a flexible vegan. Personal inconvenience is not a justification for consuming animal products. And I think that making exceptions so as not to be a bother in social settings sends the wrong message. And humane slaughter? Did he seriously just say that unironically? I'm so confused. He's clearly not vegan. Justifying humane slaughter is blatant speciesism, which is mind-boggling considering he coined the term speciesism. But for the people in the comments calling him plant-based, this dude wrote animal liberation. He's not plant-based either. Plant-based is a term used to describe people who exclude animal products from their diet only, motivated by the health benefits. Singer is clearly motivated by the ethics. I think the conversation about what makes someone a flexible vegan versus a flexitarian is nuanced. Like I said, I have mixed feelings. I would consider myself a flexible vegan in the sense that I don't care that much about the minutia. I think we enter the territory of gatekeeping when we insist that every vegan adhere to the exact same standards. Yes, there is a general standard we must adhere to, otherwise the word vegan becomes meaningless. But there are things that are a bit more gray and vegans disagree on, and I think that's okay. One being secondhand leather or wool or whatever. I think arguments against it have merit, but I personally don't feel a strong conviction to avoid it. Trace ingredients in things. I do largely avoid them, but I once ate a mint that I knew had gelatin in it. Sugar processed with bone char. Can't be bothered. Alcohol. I only recently started checking Barnivore, and since I rarely drink, I don't bother inquiring about it if someone offers me wine. Cereal or orange juice that's fortified with vitamin D that isn't technically vegan because it was extracted from an animal's stomach or whatever. Don't care. Okay, when I say I don't care, I obviously care about animal suffering. I just think these things are too insignificant to worry about. Vaccines. Although I'm against animal testing, I'm very pro-vax. I don't think a boycott is effective in this context. The solution is to push for legislation against animal testing. The Impossible Burger. In my opinion, they made a utilitarian calculation. Now let's talk about honey. Is it vegan? No. Have I consumed small amounts of honey in my 8 years as a vegan? I know honey is not vegan. Earthling Ed made a great video about it. It's why I don't buy jars of honey. Maple syrup and agave are great vegan alternatives. But I once stayed in an Airbnb and the host told us that we could eat whatever was left in the pantry, and I just couldn't resist the Honey Nut Cheerios. I don't know, it just doesn't gross me out. I know by some people's standards, my willingness to make exceptions like this makes me a flexitarian. But hear me out. I think the label vegan suits me more than flexitarian because I don't see any real harm in the things I just listed. A flexitarian might buy Girl Scout cookies or candy bars because nostalgia, or make exceptions in social settings because they're too timid to stand firm in their conviction. That is not me. Buying Girl Scout cookies that contain dairy sends a stronger demand signal than otherwise vegan cookies that may contain sugar that was processed with bone char. It also sends a different message socially. Same goes for eating a piece of bread at a social function that may have a tiny bit of egg in it, versus eating eggs. Socially, people will question why a vegan is eating eggs, but eating bread won't generate confusion. Maybe you think I'm wrong and that there is harm in eating that piece of bread or sugar or alcohol that isn't certified vegan. But I personally see more harm in being rigid to the point where you're scaring people away and making veganism look like a puritanical cult. Divorced from the other comments he made, I think his caption, which presents the idea of flexible veganism, is actually strategic and effective messaging. I mean, who is going to be drawn to veganism if all vegans are like, no, there is no flexibility at all. You must adhere to the definition as I interpret it and follow this strict set of rules or you can't call yourself vegan. In the comments, people likened it to racism. Would you call yourself a flexible anti-racist? But when was the last time you checked up on the views of the owner of the restaurant you just went to regarding Black Lives Matter? Is every purchase you make certified anti-racist? I doubt it. We're not perfectly anti-racist or perfectly feminist, so why should we expect people to be perfect vegans? What sets my idea of flexible veganism apart from Singer's is that I do see a problem with occasionally treating yourself to a non-vegan meal at a restaurant, consuming free-range eggs, and the concept of humane slaughter. This all reminded me of a video I watched a while ago, which I highly recommend you all go watch because it's very thought-provoking. I don't agree with everything he says, but he makes a lot of points that are worth considering. One being that veganism, an economic boycott, is only one strategy to achieving animal liberation. We should be more interested in employing other strategies like building alliances with other social justice movements, direct action, and political lobbying, than monitoring other people to make sure they're pure in their consumption. I remember that vegan couple had him on as a podcast guest, and it was a really interesting conversation. At the end of the day, I really don't care if people have slightly more lax standards than me. Slightly. For example, if someone who calls themselves vegan slips up and eats a cupcake while drunk at a party, it's just not worth my energy to be mad about it. I think we should be wary of the narcissism of small differences. I know things don't seem like small differences when you live in social justice land, but if you zoom out and look at things from the perspective of an outsider, these are pretty minor differences. With all the shit going on in the world, do we really need to be at each other's throats over stuff that, from a utilitarian perspective, is inconsequential? I do care, though, that a public figure and pioneer of the modern animal rights movement is putting out such conflicting messages. Singer's confusing apologism is not inconsequential, given the size of his platform. I have a few final points. One, I recognize that flexible veganism is somewhat redundant because, as far as possible and practicable, allows for a certain degree of flexibility. What is practicable is subject to interpretation. I suppose flexible veganism is allowing variance. And two, saying I'm not religious about it implies that most vegans are, and I would push back on this. It seems to me that the super strict vegan police are a vocal minority. Also, given Singer's idea of flexibility, he's implying that vegans who disagree with him are being dogmatic. This is not the case, as there are well-reasoned arguments against making exceptions in social settings so as not to be annoying, consuming free-range eggs, and indulging at a fancy restaurant once in a while. This behavior sends the message that this is not a serious issue, that animals and their secretions are food, therefore objects for consumption. And three, I would also make a distinction between a flexitarian and a reducitarian. A flexitarian is trying a bit harder than a reducitarian, in my opinion. Thank you so much for watching. I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the distinction between flexible veganism and flexitarianism? Let me know. Alright, peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me nah eat no fish, nah no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them